Welcome to Uncommon Sense, where we do our best to make it common again. I'm your host, Adrian Ahlquist, and today I'm joined by Alex Salter, who is a professor at Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University. He's also the Comparative Economics Research Fellow at TTU's Free Market Institute, and he has written over 70 scholarly articles and 150 more articles on top of that. So, and most importantly, he's a fan of distributism. He's publishing a book called Property and Liberty, and it's a rational reconstruction of distributism, which we are proposing the new name would be localism, but for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to refer to it as distributism. But yes, how are you, Alex?
Hey, Adrian, great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Great. I'm so glad. I'm so glad to have you with us. You are a very impressive person and scholar.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So before we start, I wanted to mention to our listeners, the recent Gilbert magazine that we published was called A New Name for Distributism. So if you become a member of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton, you get access to this, to the PDF of this, and you can order A New Name for Distributism, where we talk at length about this. But for the purposes of this conversation, we want to talk about this new book and the content. So first of all, why did you decide to write this book, Alex?
That's a great place to start. So I had been reading about distributism for a long time. I came to it inadvertently just through reading Chesterton on my own for other reasons.
Great.
So of course, as you go down the Chesterton rabbit hole, which is a wonderful rabbit hole to go down, I highly encourage anyone who's just a fan of prose writing and English letters in general to drop what you're doing and go pick up Orthodoxy or Everlasting Man or something like that.
Yeah, we appreciate that note. Yeah, we agree. Yeah.
We both have good taste, evidently. So as I was following the breadcrumbs in those works, I eventually got into Chesterton's works on economic and political topics. I learned about Belloc that way as well, and I started reading him. And the very first time I read these works, I was frankly unimpressed. I thought that there was a lot in there that just didn't make sense economically. And then I left it for a while. And then I came back to it. And sort of the time in between, there was my own religious reawakening. I converted to Eastern Orthodoxy and started taking Christian social teaching on all dimensions much more seriously. And as I revisited these writings more charitably than I did the first time, I realized, there's an argument here that's deserving to be taken seriously. There's some wisdom here about the operation of political and economic systems and the interplay between property and human freedom. And I think that there's a way of reconstructing some of these arguments such that even if economic scientists might quibble with some of the stories that are told and some of the mechanisms that distributists talk about, nonetheless, the broader political economic vision that they offer might be something compelling, especially given a lot of scholarly conversations today that are taking these issues very seriously.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the fact that there are things that have been written on distributism that doesn't really hold up. Not everything that has been written, even by Chesterton and Belloc, holds up. But you have a response to that, don't you? You say that even regardless of that, the important points, the important ideas are so valuable that the things that are wrong can be corrected. But we need to heed the most important ideas. Is that correct?
I think that's a good way of describing it. So early on in the book, in the introductory chapter, I distinguish between the science of economics and the art of political economy. So these are two different conversations, two different inquiries into human studies and social studies in general. What I call the science of economics, I refer to these sort of very rigorous propositions about human behavior under conditions of scarcity and how that works in market operations, market circumstances. So I think evaluated based on that, there's a lot of things that even Chesterton and Belloc are saying that, while well-intentioned, I think just are not correct about how markets actually work. But like you said, that's not what they offer that's new and interesting and worthy of enduring attention. They're making a contribution to the art of political economy, which uses the science of economics, but it's much broader. It's a conversation about the nature of the good society and human flourishing and the institutional prerequisites that actually enable that to happen. So if we shift the dialogue from the science of economics to the art of political economy, we realize there's a lot going on here that we really should be taking seriously and reading carefully, because there are some conversations right now in the public square, in public intellectual circles, and scholarly circles where we're all having these debates about What's gone wrong? Have things gone wrong? Do we need to reform our political and economic institutions? And that's exactly the kind of contribution that I think Chesterton and Belloc can help with.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense, and that's a really good point about the art of political economy. I mean, that's something that the common man who's not necessarily an economist can enter into that conversation. Like Chesterton, I wouldn't say he's necessarily an economist, but he contributed a great deal to this conversation. And so what's interesting is that you said for this book that you're publishing that you're primarily addressing scholars. Is that correct?
That's correct. I intend scholars to be my primary audience, although I also think that I have a secondary audience of public intellectuals or the intelligent layperson more generally. Mm-hmm. I tried to write the book in a scholarly way with supporting references and talking about relevant scholarly conversations within the academy, et cetera, et cetera. But I also wanted to make sure that I engage contemporary public debates about the scale and scope of markets, whether something has gone wrong with American politics. In my introductory chapter, I actually use some more public intellectual work to motivate these conversations, especially concerning the more recent talk about common good capitalism, maybe something we can talk about in a couple of minutes.
Gotcha.
So while I hope that scholars will pay attention to the work, I don't want to dissuade either people who are more writing for a popular audience from paying attention, and I definitely don't want to dissuade people who are scholars but not economists. I want theologians and economists, people who are broadly interested in the study of man and all of his capacities and environments to read the book.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. And I think it's important to get away from the idea of complete credentialism. Like you have to have, a bachelor, you have to have a master's or a PhD in economy to even have an opinion. And
as someone who's reasonably well credentialed as an economist, I can confidently say that credentials mean very, very little. Careful study means a lot. Credentials per se mean very little.
That's a very helpful note. I mean, thanks for saying that. Yeah. So first of all, before we talk about distributism and stuff, well, actually, can you define distributism? That's something I always ask who comes on to talk about distributism. I want to ask them, what's the definition? And that's helpful for people. We might have audience members that just still haven't heard of it who listen to this podcast. So could you define distributism for us?
If I were to do it briefly, I would say that distributism is a philosophy that puts property and ownership central to human flourishing, provided that that's conceived in a very specific way.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So distributism is really about the claim that private property is good so long as it is widely dispersed throughout society. Mm. The idea is we don't want to vacillate between private tyranny, right, crony capitalism, or public tyranny, outright socialism. Private property is a bulwark of freedom, both positive and negative, and can contribute to human liberty and well-being so long as all citizens have reasonable access to property, which is not something that the distributists say happens under the economic system that we normally call capitalism. They indict capitalism on several margins, mainly on the grounds that it does not make private property widely accessible enough to the majority of the citizenry. I
see. So, I mean, I'm going a little off the book here, but when we say the distribution of property, because that's where we get the name distributism or distributism, yes. It's not the distribution of wealth. That's a note we commonly have to make because, it sometimes rings in the ears for people.
Yes. In fact, Belloc himself, who we'll talk a little bit more about, I'm sure, in a minute, was very unimpressed with the egalitarian economic writings of his own time, the early 20th century.
I see.
He's actually very dismissive of this idea of equalizing wealth or equalizing purchasing power per se. Okay. For him, it was about equalizing access to productive property. So it's not just stuff, right? It has to be stuff that is capable of sustaining a productive household.
Gotcha. Yeah. So equal opportunity. That's a term that people have heard, I think, nowadays is they want equal opportunity, which is a good thing. I mean, when they associate equal opportunity with equal outcome, that's when you get a problem. That's more veering towards certain socialist mentalities, I think. That's
one among many problems, right?
Yeah. But so why you also say that a lot of there's very few economists that talk about distributism or mention it or even give it the time of day. Why do you think that is?
There are a couple of reasons. Perhaps most importantly, even in their own day, Chesterton and Belloc were not contributing to scholarly economics. They weren't having academic conversations to other economists.
Okay.
And so because of that, their work hasn't really passed into the corpus of history of economic thought. And so economists just aren't aware of it.
So it didn't enter.
I think if you read Belloc in particular and read him between the lines, I think he was actually more familiar with the state of neoclassical microeconomics, even within the academy circa 1910, than most give him credit for. The way he uses technical terms like factors of production or distribution of income, I think, is a signal that he was at least keeping up with the literature. But nonetheless, he wasn't trying to contribute to that literature. He was more interested in a broad public conversation about the applicability of Catholic social principles to the design of political economic institutions, as was Chesterton. So that's where this conversation was primarily taking place. It was in public journals among men of letters rather than scholarly economists per se.
I see. But you also say that there have been conversations between those few economists and distributist economists, or just distributists in general.
Some.
And you say, but it's been largely unsuccessful when they do have this conversation. So why would that be the case?
There's a different vocabulary. There's a different way of approaching questions of the existence of wealth and what it's for. I think a lot of economists see theologians or ethicists who are talking about distributism and see people that are not very well informed about markets and how they work and the various mechanisms that play there. And then you have theologians and ethicists who are very concerned about the morality of commercial society, who think that economists are setting themselves up as sort of a priestly scientific class that abrogates to itself exclusive authority to make judgments about these things, and often don't realize when they're not just making scientific statements, but slipping into the realm of value judgments. Right? Economists are very insistent on this idea of the positive normative distinction, talking not about the way that the world ought to be, but simply the way that it is.
Right.
That's all well and good. I think that we can quibble about, the status of that proposition, whether you can sunder reality in that way. But it nonetheless remains the case that many economists simply do not realize that in a lot of what they call their scientific work, they are smuggling in value judgments that they don't recognize as value judgments.
Wait, the value judgments you said?
Right. Yeah, value judgments. Mary Hirschfeld, who wrote a recent book called Aquinas and the Market, sort of a Thomistic take on contemporary economics, is very, very good on this point. So I would recommend that to all your readers about some of the things that contemporary scientific economics it's blind spots, what it does not know about itself.
Right. Yeah. And that seems to be a problem with the larger academia when they're trying to do science, is when they slip in value judgments. I mean, we see this a problem in the other realms as well, not just economics, but honestly, just physics and biology and all of these fields. So yeah, I would agree with that. So you mentioned a specific. The most important point that distributism puts forth, do you want me to elaborate, or what would you say the most important point of distributism is?
So I would go one step further and extend it even beyond the importance of widely dispersed, or at least widely dispersed, access to private property. Mm-hmm. I read the distributist as making a claim about the nature of human liberty. Okay. And where political and economic liberty actually come from. And so one of the things that I think is particularly interesting, especially in Belloc's writings, is he makes this argument that free societies are not just about institutionalizing negative freedom and sort of preventing other people from encroaching on or coercing me. There's also an important element of positive freedom, the capacity to live a flourishing, fulfilling life in community. There's a delicate balance between these two things. Furthermore, widely dispersed access to private productive property is necessary to keep that balancing act up, so that we are actually able to flourish in community. And there's one more claim, which is that markets, if left to themselves, the resulting distribution of income follows predictable laws. Yeah. But the distribution of income will not necessarily be that which is conducive to the maintenance of free political institutions, local political control, democracy, reserved rights, all these things that are not conservative, are not liberal, that are just sort of the institutional respect for the dignity of the human person. Getting a society that respects these things, locally and institutionally, requires the use of economic resources in a specific way that may, and in fact often does, widely diverge from the ordinary operations of the market mechanism.
Okay, I see.
So being
So
as charitable to these guys as possible, that's what I think that they're
yeah,
saying.
yeah.
And I think that that's an interesting claim. Like that's a claim that needs to be taken very seriously.
Yeah. And so there's a balance between security and liberty. I think you mentioned something along those lines, and feel free to correct me because again, I'm not an economist. I took one microeconomics class in college. So, but
That's better than one macroeconomics class in college.
okay, good to know. But yeah, so there's a certain aspect of security and of liberty. And what's interesting, I think, is that people tend to have two different personalities: one that values security a lot more, and then one that values liberty. But what's nice about distributism is that it protects both. Wouldn't you say?
I think it's pretty important to distributism as a project that it actually rejects the dichotomy. It's not only that there are these two kinds of liberty, it's that conceived rightly and ordered rightly, they are actually mutually supportive.
Oh, that's
So
good.
Belloc tells the story about like the rise of the free peasantry in Europe beginning in the High Middle Ages, and he actually traces that back to the fall of the Roman Empire. And
Okay.
the reason that's important is if you're like a rural Roman landowner whose land was mostly worked by slaves, when the Roman Empire falls and you can't count on the Roman army to enforce order on your property anymore, you need to renegotiate the terms of your relationship with your former slaves. Because guess what? They're not going to just obey you now that you don't have your enforcement mechanism. So gradually, slavery becomes serfdom, becomes free tenancy. And this idea that landed elites are renegotiating the relationships with the people who work their land. And that actually gave the eventual rise of the free peasantry a lot of economic security, independent of whatever political authorities were there, simply because the old time fiscal resource bargains were no longer sustainable. And so the story that Belloc is telling, in essence, is that de facto economic security gave rise to de jure political liberty. To the extent that social scientists think about it at all today, we usually reverse that story, right? We usually think of de jure political liberty, right? Democracy, reserved rights, all these good things, creating an environment of economic freedom. The distributists are saying, wait, we need to also think about the direction of causality between an independently existing economic freedom and political liberty. Right. So they're sort of turning the story on their head and showing that there's actually a bi-directional causal relationship between these things, which is very important because if there are feedback effects there in the way that we interact political with economic liberty, if we think it only works one way and we design our political institutions on that assumption, stuff might go bad, right? If you base your institutional reforms or design or whatever based on a faulty theory of what's causing what, you're going to get results that you don't want. So that's why I think it's in particular important to take Chesterton and Belloc pretty seriously on this issue.
Yeah, and on that note, do you think part of the problem, part of the disconnect between distributists and other economists is a disagreement about something much more base, something much more root, like the nature of the human person? Would you say, so, or the dignity of the human person? Because I know that's something very Catholic. We talk about the dignity of the human person. That's part of the. That's what I remember. That's one of the reasons that was articulated against, complete capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism. But do you think there's a certain disagreement there that we're hitting a barrier, we're creating some friction?
I think that's one of the reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So for distributists, and especially people who are explicitly influenced by Catholic social teaching, economics never really lost its status as a moral science. The dignity of the human person has to be central to the analysis, and whatever positive explanatory work that we're doing sort of revolves around that central ethical project of the nature of the good society and how we respect human dignity.
I see.
Economists try to do work that explains the way the world works without reference to their own value judgments about the way that they think the world ought to work. Okay. So naturally, that gets us back into this thing about the positive normative distinction, whether that's something that's acceptable, philosophically okay, philosophically fraudulent. For my own purposes, I don't think that the positive normative distinction is an ontological statement. I don't think that we're saying something about reality. I think that we're saying something about us, the theorist, the social scientist, and the realm of reality that we just happen to be focusing on at the moment. So I think that all people who do political economy influenced by Catholic social teaching are right, that economists don't have a very robust normative theory to hang their hat on, right? Their sense of oughtness is underdeveloped and weak. But I also agree with the economist that most people who are influenced by Catholic social teaching and try and jump immediately from there to do economics don't recognize that there is a way that markets work,
Yeah.
and that we need to learn the way, those basic stories about how markets work, the science of economics, if we're actually going to be good at the art of political economy.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense because I mean, first you have to study what's there, and that's
Right.
the role of the economist. I mean, and I remember that. I remember studying actually in college, and one of the assumptions a lot of times that you need to make when you're studying economics is you have a rational consumer. Because that if you start by assuming that you have an irrational consumer, which a lot of us are irrational, that's part of it. But if you start from there, then I mean that's not tenable. I mean you first have to start with a more deterministic model. I don't know. Does that kind of make sense?
I would agree with that way of phrasing it. I would go one step further and say rationality is actually what you need to assume about human behavior in order to make sense of it at all.
Oh, okay, cool.
And at a broad level, rationality just means goal-oriented, right? It's our teleological nature as goal-seeking entities.
Okay.
A lot of people, when they study economics, thinks that if we assume that people are rational, that means that we're lightning calculators of pleasure and pain, or that we always make correct decisions. That's not what rationality means. The models that we develop would be extremely limited in their use if we relied on such a thick notion of human cognition. Instead, all we assume in economics for scientific purposes is that people have goals and try to achieve those goals as effectively as they know how.
Okay.
That's rationality. And when you think about it, that's not a very controversial statement. And furthermore, I don't even know what it would look like to try and interpret human behavior if you assume that that wasn't the case. Right? Imagine that you're going upstairs and you pass someone who's going downstairs. You ask that person where they're going. They say, "I'm going to the roof." You stop and pause. Are you going somewhere before you go to the roof? The person replies, "No, I'm immediately going to the roof." Right? I'm going straight to the roof. I'm going nowhere else beforehand. You would either need to conclude that either this person doesn't know what a roof is, or that their behavior is just completely unintelligible, right? They're just so wacko that you can't understand them.
Yeah.
So this idea is that you need to find a way to interpret what people are actually doing in light of their own goals and value systems. Otherwise, you can't actually explain human behavior, right? Assuming irrationality means that humans are unintelligible, right? You might as well say that ghosts did it. You can't actually figure out why people are doing what they're doing. Irrationality, is the close of a conversation because you can't really do anything with irrationality. You need to assume a basic coherence to human decision making if you want to understand what people do at all in any sphere of life.
Okay, wow. Blowing my mind.
I try.
Yeah. All right. So I have nothing to add to that. But do you have anything before I ask about common good capitalism?
Yeah, I do. So one of the reasons that I brought that up, that technical point about, the basics of economic theory, is that it actually does matter for this distributism debate, right? And the reason that it does matter for this distributism debate is because this minimalist model of human purposiveness is going to be something that really doesn't have all that much empirical content, right? Strictly speaking, rational choice is a purely formal logic of human action. But how human action manifests depends on the incentives and information that people have. Well, now you're talking about social institutions, right? Now you're talking about markets. Now you're talking about politics. These things are contingent. These things can be reformed. These things can be changed, right? So you can't get around the fact that the demand curve for goods and services slopes down, right? That's, just one of those things that's going to be true no matter what your institutional environment looks like. But you can change the incentives that people face at the margins such that if you wanted to implement the scheme to more widely distribute private property, right, you can find a way to do that while minimizing the economic costs associated with that, and also channeling that widely distributed property into a way that maintains the integrity of the political economic system. That's what statesmanship is, right? That's what creative constitutional craftsmanship is. Using what we know about human behavior under conditions of scarcity and also applying that to our normative vision of man, his vocation, his social nature, and trying to find out, okay, now what institutions do we actually need? What rules of the game do we actually have to craft that are consistent with what we know about how humans behave and are also consistent with how humans ought to behave? right, in terms of fulfilling their normative vocation. That's the conversation that distributism is having, properly conceived. And that's where I think that we need to focus all the attention.
Okay, so then how would that come about? What are some methods to ensure that people have the equal access to property? I know that's a much more complicated question, but can you?
That is the $1 million question, so to speak. So Belloc and Chesterton in their various works talk about various proposals. Some of these I think have promise, some of them don't. Belloc and Chesterton talk about things like one of the ways that you promote access to property isn't necessarily by giving people stuff, but by preventing excessive industrial concentration.
Okay.
Right. So you operate not on giving stuff to the little man, but just stopping the big guy from becoming too big, just so he can't corner a market. And so steeply graduated, business taxes would be one way of keeping a level playing field. You may disagree with that. I'm still wrestling with that in my head. But these are some of the mechanisms that they talk about. They wouldn't be terribly impressed with contemporary proposals for what's called a guaranteed basic income. I don't know if you're familiar with that proposal, but there's been some discussion of the national government just handing people a check, $10,000 a year simply for existing. Right? A lot of people would think that would do a lot to bring about equality. Chesterton and Belloc would look at that as mere welfarism, right? It might be one policy among many that we pursue, but by no means is that sufficient. Well, and just giving people purchasing power isn't going to make them free.
I would suspect, or I would expect Chesterton to say, that basic income, if you will, probably should come from the family. But because he identifies the family being the core unit of society, and it's very valuable as an idea to him. So but not everyone has that availability of having a well-structured family that can provide for you for the early your early years. So that's why I remember when Andrew Yang ran on universal basic income, and he made some good arguments. I'm undecided too. I can't say for sure one way or the other right now, but I don't know. That's something.
Yeah, it's a complicated policy issue, not least of which how exactly we're going to afford to send everybody in America $10,000 checks or $5,000 checks or whatever.
And to be fair,
and I don't want to say that that's an anti-distributist proposal. That's not what I'm arguing. Instead, I'm arguing that mere transfer of purchasing power is nowhere near enough in terms of guaranteeing human freedom for the distributists. If that's a necessary part of the plan, that's like the least you can do. Right? They're thinking of a much more rich notion of availability and access to property and human freedom than just mere, here's a check, go buy stuff.
Gotcha. Yeah. And to be fair, my question was obviously loaded, and certain solutions might work for certain different cultures. Like it's hard to have a practical tactic for solving a certain situation that is universal. It would work in any setting, any type of culture that has this, any type of values. So sometimes a specific solution is needed for a specific time, for a specific state or a specific country. But what's funny is when someone proposes it in the political sphere, everyone wants to immediately, say this is against general values and stuff. Well, it's not necessarily. It might work for this specific case. It might not work always. But that's something I've found. I don't know if you can speak to that at all.
So I'm very sympathetic to that, and I think that Chesterton and Belloc are too, right? Chesterton, there's this literary convention or metaphor that we call Chesterton's fence, right? I don't remember the exact thing that he said, but it was something like, if you see a fence standing out in the middle of a field, not apparently doing anything, and want to tear it down because you don't understand what that fence is there for, that's the best evidence you could possibly marshal that you should not touch that fence. Only the person who knows what the fence is there for should be able to say whether you repair it or whether you tear it down, right? You need to be able to understand why a thing is, even if it's seemingly irrational, right? So going back to this rationality versus irrationality point earlier.
Yeah.
Even if it seemingly serves no purpose, you need to find the hidden purpose, because one is going to be there. And only if you can answer that question is it safe to tear down the fence.
Yeah.
Chesterton and Belloc are not trying to be universal political economic legislators. They are taking the universal principles of Catholic social teaching, right? These timeless, eternal facts about human dignity. They're bringing them to a contemporary, well, for them, contemporary context, which again, for them was early 20th century English industrial capitalism, which is very different than what we face. And they were trying to look for policy solutions or ways of conducting creative constitutional craftsmanship to reform the political economic landscape in their own time.
Mm.
So we can't necessarily just like take their toolkit and say, okay, 21st century America, like this is what we're going to do. That might not work. They wouldn't want to be universal legislators. They're not, frankly, that arrogant.
Yeah.
But they do insist that the principles about human dignity and all the statements about the relationship between property and freedom that flow from that are timeless, or at least generalize across institutional contexts enough that normative idea of human flourishing and human dignity, that's our starting point. So then the question becomes, how can we use economic science and the art of political economy to design social structures that respect these things, given the facts on the ground?
Yeah, and part of that, by the way, this is part of the reason we're proposing to change the name to localism, because this spans over space, not only time, but what does someone in New York have in common with someone in Alabama? They share certain things, but there might be a law that is totally appropriate in New York that doesn't make sense in Alabama, and that just would make sense. Like what do you have in common with that person? If you do have something in common, okay, that's a law, but there's that's why we want to stay local, and try to be as have laws that apply to who it applies to. So that's part of the reasoning there. So yeah, but so now I want to ask you about common good capitalism. So there's laissez-faire capitalism and there's authoritarian capitalism, and then there's this new term I've never heard, actually, common good capitalism. And maybe that's because I don't know, I should know it, but do you want to explain what the conversation is there, the deal is there?
Right. So in 2019, Senator Marco Rubio gave a speech at the business school at Catholic University of America. And he sort of popularized, I don't think he invented it, but he popularized this idea of common good capitalism. So the premise for his speech, which I do not necessarily agree with, but this is what he's saying, is that existing capitalism in the United States has sort of evolved into a financial frenzy, which has benefited financiers and high-tech workers, but has sort of left the rest of America behind. It's no longer a one nation, a rising tide lifts all boats sort of arrangement. We need to do something about that. And so he introduced the principles of Catholic social teaching as a way of understanding how we can reform capitalism and reorient it towards the common good.
Okay.
So then he goes to talk about a bunch of worker-friendly policies, family-friendly policies, changes to foreign policy also that would benefit what he conceives of as the majority of American households and the majority of American families. Okay. So you can conceive of this as just sort of a project for broadening the stakeholders in the existing political economic order, making sure that our market arrangements benefit all rather than just a privileged few. That's obviously something that a lot of people are very sympathetic to, myself included. And what makes it common good capitalism is that it is explicitly informed by the social doctrine of the Catholic Church. So Rubio in that speech drew on Rerum Novarum, he drew on the various social encyclicals that laid out these principles, and then talked about the need to, not to jettison capitalism, right, but to reform it at the margins to better achieve these goals.
Okay.
So that's part of a broader conversation that I think is taking place within American conservative intellectual circles. I think common good capitalism is really just a subset of common good conservatism, which has sort of been this reorientation of American conservatism in the wake of 2016, away from Ronald Reagan style fusionism, more towards a substantive notion of the common good, one that is friendlier towards using state power, even national government power, to advance a concrete vision of human flourishing. And I think common good capitalism takes on that context. Okay. Just so there's no question of where I'm coming from, I proudly identify as a zombie Reaganite, and I would smile if you call me a fusionist. So I want to emphasize that I'm not necessarily on board with these guys with all things. So
gotcha.
That makes me a dinosaur. But that's where I am.
Well, thanks for clarifying. Yeah. Thanks. Well, I have one more question, but if you want to elaborate on anything else that I'm missing, because I know I'm missing stuff, feel
It's
free
been
to.
a great conversation. It's been
Yeah.
it's been flowing nicely. I like it.
For sure. I mean, yeah, you know your stuff, which is great. I mean, it's great to have people with credentials, just because it starts the conversation with the other people with credentials, right? At least that we have something going. So I have one more question. You write at one point, while distributism is not necessarily Catholic, it is explicitly Catholic. That sounds very Chestertonian, first of all, which is cool. It's very paradoxical. Why would you say that?
Yeah, so I think the way I'm trying to remember the line, I think what I meant to say is distributism explicitly draws on Catholic social teaching. It is a Catholic project.
Yeah.
But that does not necessarily mean that it is only appreciable to Catholics or applicable to a Catholic society.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Right? Catholic social teaching has found many fans and adherents, even among those who are not formally in communion with the Roman Catholic Church, like me, like many American Protestants, like many men and women of other faith traditions and other faith backgrounds, because it really does teach us something essential about what it means to treat the human person as something of infinite value, of infinite worth, and what that requires in terms of how we structure our social institutions. So while Chesterton and Belloc and all distributists are explicitly looking to the social doctrine of the church, the lessons that they're cultivating are broader than that. You don't have to be Catholic to find value in Catholic social teaching, is what I'm saying with that.
Yes. Okay, and that makes sense. I agree with that. Yeah, it shouldn't stay within just the Catholic realm. It's a proposed solution, not just for Catholic communities.
Yeah. I mean, that's intended to be a universal thing, right? A small c Catholicos thing.
Yep, exactly.
So
very nice.
That's absolutely as it should be.
Awesome. Well, that's great. I love this. I mean, when your book comes out, Property and Liberty, I suggest everyone go and get it. And
thank you.
I hope we can put this socioeconomic principle, or the art, at least the art of what was it called? The art of
political economy, I've been calling it. Yeah.
Political economy at the forefront of this conversation. I've said a conversation a lot during this podcast, but yeah.
That's okay. That's perfectly fine. Yeah. So in terms of where the book's at right now, I just finished a rough draft of the introduction. All the meat chapters, all the substantive chapters are done. I'm working on a rough draft of the conclusion. I have to go back and edit the various chapters for feedback that I've gotten from scholars and friends. But we're in pretty good shape. My deadline is to get it to the publisher, which is Catholic University of America Press, by December of this calendar year. But I'm confident that I'm going to come in before that. Awesome. So I will definitely keep you updated about where we are in terms of the editing and proofing process. I want to make sure that many people know about when this is going to come out. And I hope it stimulates a wide conversation, and that it actually builds a bridge between economists on the one hand and theologians and ethicists on the other hand, because for too long, our two camps have been sort of, we've been either ships passing in the night, or we've been like openly firing on each other as we've gone past. So on the rare occasion where we deign to notice each other, and it's a shame, because there are so many profitable conversations. See, there's the word again. So many profitable conversations that we could have. And I hope that this book, which is comparatively modest in its scope, will be the first step of building a bridge so we can actually have the conversations that
absolutely. I completely agree. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being on this podcast, Alex. It was great having you.
Thank you, Adrian. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you. For all those listening, by the way, I mentioned becoming a member of the Society of G.K. Chesterton. You can read more about this. And you can buy The Hound of Distributism. That's also on our shop, and you get a member discount. I mentioned it, chesterton.org/membership is what I didn't say before. Go to chesterton.org/membership, and you can become a member there. But thank you all for listening. And until next time, help us to make uncommon sense common again.